Playing as a Paladin in Elden Ring gives you a ton of options. You get the high damage, lots of heals and defenses, but most important, you also get to look flashy as heck while doing it. That's why in today's video we'll take a look at a strength/faith Paladin build for the end game, so let's begin. Now with this, I aim to fit the Paladin theme as much as possible, so everything from the skills and abilities all the way up to the items and weapons on my character, which is why I made use of the Banished Knight's Greatsword, an excellent option, and just slightly worse with a heavy affinity compared to the Iron Greatsword, but it looks much better and comes with other advantages. The bread and butter though is going to be the Blade Dance Echauffeur, put with a heavy affinity since we're making use of strength a lot more than any other stat with this build, and this is going to give you a lot of damage and interrupts. Against enemies, it's an excellent choice, has a really good range, has very little wind up, and you pretty much spam it for a lot of damage, up to 5k against most of the enemies when fully buffed. An alternative to this would be the Iron Greatsword or the Inseparable Greatsword, but I found that both of these are actually not the best options. Iron Greatsword simply doesn't look that good, and there's only a 20 points of attack rating difference between these with a heavy affinity at this stage in the game, so personally I just went with the Banished Knight. The second reason is because Banished Knights shares the same R1 attack with the Inseparable Sword, which in my opinion is one of the best for any greatsword in the game. It's very different than anything else in the game, and just like that slash with the Blade Dance, it deals a great job at interrupting enemies and eventually even stunning them. So if you want like the best case scenario, Banished Knight's Greatsword gives you the best of both worlds. The second weapon we're gonna make use of is obviously going to be the Great Stars, again with a heavy affinity so that we can buff it later with different enchants, and putting a Prayerful Strike, the ultimate Paladin move in Elden Ring. This is a high damage, high stun actually, that perfectly couples with a great hammer like this, and more important, it gives you a massive heal per hit. Even more so when you consider the fact that Great Stars already comes with a passive heal on hit and a blood loss buildup of 55 anyway, so overall it's the best couple you can have with this kind of setup. In terms of seals, not much to talk about here. We're using the Clawmark seal, which gives me 268 incantation scaling, since it does scale both from strength and faith, which I have invested both into, of course with a lot more points into strength, since that gives me a lot more damage and gives me a little bit more freedom in choosing which passives and actives to apply to my swords later down the line. As far as the talismans, it's the usual Shard of Alexander, since it greatly boosts the attack power of our skills, so this includes both the skills on the Great Sword as well as the Great Stars. There's also a Sacred Scorpion Charm, since I'm mainly making use of holy attacks, but obviously you can switch this to something different, even something that buffs fire damage in case you want to go for a Blood Flame Blade. Meanwhile, the Earth Tree Favor +2 raises all of the stats that we need for this tanky build, so that's gonna be the maximum HP, stamina, and more important, equip load. As I've said, we're gonna make use of heavy types of armor sets that buff our defenses a lot, so in this case we need as much equip load as possible, but also stamina so we don't fat roll. Obviously, on a final note, the Radagon Sword Seal, I always include this in my build, but it's not something that you have to run with if you don't want to. It's a good stat increase for like 3 or 4 stats that you're making use anyway with this build, so might as well just pick it. But I'm pretty sure that you can also run with a Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, since you do a lot of successive attacks. That's going to boost up your attack rating even more. Maybe even an Ancestral Spirit Horn, since you do stun enemies a lot and perform critical hits, you might be able to restore some FP and have a lot more sustain. Or if you're like me and prefer to like face tank enemies that we're gonna talk about in just a little bit, the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to boost up your physical damage negation by about 20% is an even more amazing choice. Now in terms of general gameplay gameplay here is what I'm running with. So against most enemies we're gonna make use of the great sword with the blade dance, and also imbue that with either a sacred blade or maybe something like a blood flame blade if you want some bleeds on top. This is going to deal a ton of damage. The skill is absolutely amazing. It also has a long reach, and you also get to interrupt most of the enemies. More important though, you can also use the R1 series of attacks, which again don't cost anything, barely consume any of your stamina, but you do also get to interrupt and eventually even stun full on enemies. For anything else that drops your HP levels, especially if you use the Dragon Crest Talisman for more defenses, you can just face tank everything with the Great Stars and the Prayerful Strike. I really enjoy this combo, makes it the ultimate Paladin move to the point that you maybe don't even need to dodge that much, if at all, against many of the bosses in the game. So much so in fact that against some of them you can fully heal yourself up without ever doing any dodging and then just like massacre them in the same fight. I think that that's definitely the ultimate Paladin move you can pull off right there. Obviously on top of this we're also making use of Flame Granny Strength and the Golden Vow, since this increases our attack rating even more, and more important, some of our defenses get slightly reduced, which is why we do need a ton of defenses with this build. But with that you're gonna be able to reach over 1000 AR with the Great Sword itself, which is amazing given the fact that you can also couple this with a shield, for example. Riposte with this build works extremely well. You can destroy enemies easily in no more than one swing, and if there's any enemies that do resist that, you can always switch to two-handing it and then killing them off like that. Now since I did want to fit the theme, I went with the Order's Blade in this case, simply because I wanted to have as much gold as possible with this build, but obviously you can more than make use of that Blood Flame Blade in case you want some additional bleed. This proves to be an excellent choice, especially against bosses like Melania, which is easily interruptible, but it works on any other boss or enemy that flinches easily, and you can also further interrupt them with the Bloodlust that pops up for some additional nice damage, and it pops off really often, especially if you get to spam them against them really easily. Now on a final note, the only other thing I want to cover in this video is in terms of our stats. As you've likely noticed, this build is going to heavily focus on strength, so about 60 points into that, with the 5 remaining coming from that source seal. Faith, meanwhile, we invested 31 points. Usually I would go for 35, but in this case we made use of the Order's Blade, so we needed about 13 points into intelligence. But obviously you don't have to do that. If you go with the Blood Flame Blade instead, just put one more point into arcane to get 10 and be able to just use it like that and have 34 into faith. For the mind attribute, 20 I found to be perfectly enough. You don't need more, it's plenty enough to fully buff yourself, then get a chunk of one of those potions and be able to like spam your abilities in most of the combat encounters. And finally that endurance, about 25 points, so yeah, that we can block a little bit more from enemies or dodge a little bit more, but you can play around with these as you see fit. But as always, this is pretty much it with the build. Totally let me know down below if you're using anything similar to this or any other type of variation. In the meantime, if you really enjoyed the video, let me know down below by leaving a like, subscribing and activating the notification bell, and I'll see you guys in the next one.